These are pieces of conventional wisdom that have driven correctional policy for the past several decades, but that are now starting to change because, in fact, they turn out to be fallacies. So the first one is that crime and incarceration rates are determined by these broad social, economic, and demographic forces, right? Sort of just beyond the control of government. Stuff happens, and crime gets committed, and basically the state prison system is in a reactive mode and just has to sort of write more crime, more criminals, more convictions, more sentences, and it just all adds up, and we're stuck with the end result. And as it turns out, in fact, certainly those things matter, but policy choices actually are the primary driver of the size and cost of a state's correctional system. You see the dramatic increase that happened in the prison population to the point where in 2008 we hit this peak of having actually 1 out of every 100 adults in this country behind bars, either in prison or jail. That's fallen back slightly since that peak. But you see that incredible rise there was obviously the result of yes, increased crime, no doubt, related to, a lot of it related to drugs, but certainly the policies from law enforcement through sentencing that contributed to that rise in the prison population. Two factors, and two factors only, that determine the size and cost of the prison of your prison system or your juvenile system, and that is admissions and length of stay. How many come in, and how long do they stay? I'm going to show this slide to pick on our friends from South Carolina here a little bit on the admissions front. In fairness, in South Carolina, you can go to, and same in North Carolina, I think they're the only two states that have this kind of policy. You can go to prison, and you do go to state prison if your sentence is 90 days or more. So it's not the usual split off at a year-long felony. But there were a lot more people sent to prison through policy decisions. And then in terms of length of stay, I think this graph from our time served report from last year really graphically portrays the sort of different policies that went into place. And you'll just notice the regional variation here, right, so that there's no particular regional pattern to this. It's going to be a little hard to see, but these first set of states, these dark blue states, are the states that had, in the 2 decades from 1990 to through 2009, the largest increases in the amount of time that inmates were serving in their prison systems. So you got Florida down there in the lead with a jump of 166%, California, and so on. Then you had these next set of states that had increases of between 26 and 50% in terms of length of time served. These smattering of states had some growth, but not more than 25%. And then these set of states, which also is dispersed geographically, had actual decreases in length of stay for inmates coming out in 1990 versus coming out in 2009. Second fallacy, and this I think these are all key, but this is a particularly important one, and that is if you reduce the incarceration rate and you scale back your prison population, the crime rate's just simply going to go up, right? It's often referred to as the X chart, right? And a lot of people will try to make the argument, well, incarceration went up and crime went down. It's as simple as that, end of story. The fact is that states, as we've seen over the past decade or so, can have both less crime and less imprisonment. The best research shows that increased imprisonment contributed to about 25-30% of the crime drop, which is significant, but there's a lot left that's explained by other things. One particularly graphic example of this involves Florida and New York. So Florida started this decade, starting in 1990, with about 70,000 inmates, and increased its prison population by about 30,000 to just over 100,000. In that same period of time, New York started also about 70,000, but they dropped the population by 10,000. So what do you think happened with the crime rates? Florida was down 28%, New York was down as well, but down actually a little bit more. Next one, the public simply wants to lock up everyone and throw away the key. In fact, a lot of polling that we have done, we've done it in bipartisan polling efforts with the guy who was John McCain's lead pollster for his presidential campaign, and the guy who was Obama's pollster, and other bipartisan teams have shown broad, extremely broad support for the general concept of alternatives for lower-level offenders, and very broad support for specific policy changes as well, not just the conceptual level stuff. One conceptual level example, some of the money that we're spending on locking up low-risk nonviolent inmates should be shifted to strengthen community corrections programs like parole and probation. Do you agree with this or not? 84% overall agree. You see strong consensus across party affiliation and region of the country. And those of you who are political junkies or into polls will know that pollster will tell you if you see a strongly agree percent that's in the 30s or 40s, that's a pretty intense level of support. And as you can see from some of these numbers here on this general piece, they're strongly supports are way in excess of what pollsters would generally be looking to see. There are other aspects of this public opinion piece. I think certainly those in Kentucky are aware of the role that the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce played a couple of years ago in raising their hands and saying, hey, we need to change directions on this. Business leaders in other states are also stepping forward. And of course, the Right on Crime initiative, which I hope everybody in the room is aware of at this point. Some of the nation's leading conservatives coming out and saying, together, conservatives are known for being tough on crime, but we also must be tough on criminal justice spending, and really starting to apply that lens as well. And so all these voices, the public voice, business leaders, victims' voices, we have over 100 victims organizations representatives that have signed on to a statement. Fourth, policy reformers will suffer at the ballot box, not become a partisan issue, and that's because it really is attracting support from both sides of the aisle and both ideologies. I won't spend long on this, but it's pretty clear that conservatives are coming at this issue from the perspectives of limited government, fiscal discipline, and so on. You see the points here. Liberals tend to come at it from more perspective of civil rights and social justice, but in the end, they're getting to the same little destination there. These are the states that have done some kind of what we call justice reinvestment, this basic principle of a data-driven bipartisan approach to looking at your state's particular data and coming up with solutions to make sure the right people are in prison and the people who aren't going are being handled effectively otherwise. The yellow states are states that in our judgment have made sort of more minor important but not comprehensive reforms. The blue states are states that have undertaken some comprehensive reforms, and the ones in green are, and this is on the adult side, the ones in green are the ones that are just kicking off efforts now. This is the biggest one that's out there, and I spent a lot of time speaking with press to try to debunk the notion that Representative Neal and Representative Tilley and Representative Madden and everybody else who's involved here are doing this because they're trying to save money. It is the easiest thing for a reporter to do, to just put it out there, the saying, driven by tight budgets, right? And it's hard for them to understand after 20 years, 25 years of ratcheting up penalties all the time, how something else could be going on. It must just be about the money. These guys must be holding their noses at saying this kind of stuff really stinks, but I got to do it because we got to save some money. The reality, of course, is that this is really happening because of the success of states like Texas and South Carolina early on in reducing imprisonment and crime and recidivism at the same time, because of this public support and because of improvements in our ability to supervise people with.
We're going to start, though, with the meat of what justice reinvestment really is, and it's based on, as we know, evidence-based policy and numbers, data, science that drives these reforms. And I think from my end at Kentucky, science and numbers and data that was hard to turn away from. And so I think these gentlemen will agree with that. I'll tell you, as part of our efforts, that we became Pew's poster child, as I like to say, Representative Madden, as you've heard us all say before, because in Kentucky in 2007, as the 1 in 100 report was being printed, Kentucky led the country in prison growth. And I don't mean we just led the country. It was like Secretariat down the home stretch. In the decade ending in 2009, our prison growth rate was 45%, and the rest of the country is growing at a rate of 13%. So put that into perspective, in a country that comprises about 5% of the world's population, yet incarcerates about 25% of the world's prisoners. We remain one of the safer states in the South even. Our crime rate was relatively low, and it had been dropping. Recidivism had been all over the map, but unaffected by the prison population. And let me report today, and that, again, we have a number of successes that we can celebrate. All these states can, but today recidivism is down 5 percentage points in Kentucky 2 years after our reform effort, and the prison population is down. It was projected to be somewhere around 25 or 26,000. It's now at 19,600 and change.
I start by just saying that we got a note from one of Georgia's finest, Newt Gingrich, and he made a comment about South Carolina, which was a big start. And what he said was about half of South Carolina's prison population is being held for nonviolent offenses. Such low-level violations, as well as certain nonviolent drug-related crimes, can be punished in other ways that aren't as expensive as prison. We build prisons for people we're afraid of, yet South Carolina has filled them up with people that they're just mad at. And so what happened was is that we found that in our state we had a little over 4 million people, that our prison population was destined to grow to 28,000 people. We had about 25,000. We saw that we had an annualized cost that was going to go up about 141 million and needed to end up building a prison. So when we start getting the data, what we found was this: about 44% of the prison population in South Carolina, they were in there for prison sentences of 18 months or less. We had about 46% of the violent crimes, the class felonies, was the lowest felony, which was the class F felonies. And then what we found was is that the drug population had increased enormously over the last 25 years. But one of the big drivers was is that the technical violations were amounting to a large percentage of the readmissions, and about 66% of those people that were on probation were going back into prison for technical violations, those violations that were non-criminal in nature, for not having the right address, for failing a drug test, and those kinds of things. And then we saw that our probation, our parole system was somewhat of no system at all. We had over 5,000 some odd folks that had applied for parole. Only 511 was granted parole. 3,993 were denied. About 1,000 withdrew their applications. And so we looked at it and we saw that one of the things that really drew attention was one of the largest drivers in the system was driving under suspension, non-DUI related. And so what we found was that that was the third most incarcerated offense. And what we did in South Carolina was we had to get one, buy-in from the governor, buy-in from the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court, buy-in from the legislature. We actually had a representation on the panel, on the group, sort of symbolic of what was in the body. Because at the end of the day, you got to get the votes. You got to get enough votes to end up passing the bill. And that's on that particular day. So how do you win? You got to get the most votes. So first they plowed the ground. They got Department of Corrections involved, juvenile justice, probation, pardon, parole, prosecution coordination, public defenders, criminal defense lawyers, the attorney general, court administration, the magistrates, the sheriffs, the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, the Centers for Fathers and Families, crime victim representatives. And so they have to be maintained as you go through the process. And so they're still involved in the process. It made it easier when you got to the body, and when Pew came in and made their suggestions based upon the evidence base, first thing that we had to do was we had a little motto going around. We got to take the P out of politics and put it into people. And that's what mattered. And so it wasn't a partisan issue. We had to make certain that we did what the evidence required. Did we do everything that we wanted to do? No. Did we do the major things that were suggested? Yes. We built on consensus for the things that we agreed upon. There's a laundry list of 24 or 25 things that's added to our report that were never passed. Most of those were things that individuals wanted, but we could not get a consensus on. we established work groups instead of committees, and therefore it had buy-in. So committees make decisions, work groups have discussions. Work groups brought the issues before the committee, then we voted on it. And so when we went through the body, we did have something, Senator, that we wanted to get all the House members to come over to the Senate when we were having the meetings, and so we did not want amendments on the floor. So we had no amendments on the floor as we went through the whole process. Thereafter, I think that we passed it in the Senate unanimously, and just a couple of people voted against it in the House of Representatives. What we've done is that we put our package together, and we'll talk about that some. We had a lot of statutory provisions. We had to make certain that we got the votes. We added crimes to the violent crime list, put in release mechanisms to tighten up some matters with probation. One of the major things I think that happened is that we set up a Sentence Reform Oversight Committee. The Sentence Reform Oversight Committee obviously had some detractors, but we sunset it for 5 years. We wanted to make sure to get that same group that we had in the beginning to continue to come back. We had some goals there. We had to report to the governor, report to both bodies, and report to the Supreme Court. We are trying to make sure that we take care of any expenditures that we have that have been avoided, make sure that we give a report upon those. That committee is still in place. The Senate's Oversight Committee is critical, so you can make sure that you can see where you come from, where you're going, and you can see the impact. And then once you figure that out, then you can see where you need to go. Being able to determine the marginal cost as it relates to the prison population as to what's being saved. There's about $1 million that we had. The question is that how do you do the reinvestment, get it into your appropriations? Then we had some more this past year. We're up to about $3 million in cost avoidance now after the second year, keeping the numbers. And we don't have the numbers now for 2013 for this year yet. We did have a legislative audit report that came out on one of our agencies that's held us back some, but we anticipate getting the numbers on cost avoidance. From 25,000, we're down now to 21,500 people that are incarcerated. It's dropping at about 1,000 in population per year.
As we began our criminal justice reform, it became very evident through the work of our council, the help of the assistance of Pew, and looking at the numbers. It became very evident where our drivers were in our prison growth, where we were going. You saw the slide during Adam's presentation. We were projected to cost an additional $264 million over the next 5 years in our prison population, the growth of our prison budget. So we began looking at the numbers, and what we found was that drug and property offenders represented 60% of all of our admissions in the prison system, and 5 of the top 6 most common prison admissions were from drug and property crimes. That's burglary, forgery, possession of cocaine, theft by taking, and theft by receiving stolen properties. And in 2010, we had over 5,000 low-risk drug and property offenders go to prison for the first time. Over 5,000 in 2010 low-risk drug and property offenders went to the prison for the first time. That was 25% of all admissions in 2010. So when you start seeing that kind of data, it becomes evident immediately where you need to begin. So that's where we started, and that the data was very important. As we began looking at the science, the things that work based on your offenders, that science was also important. One of the things, for example, we expanded our drug courts. We set standards for our drug courts. We increased from about $2 million in state funds to about $12 million in state funds for drug courts. One of the things we found, a lot of our drug courts were disqualifying the people who needed drug court the most. It's easy to cherry pick and think I'm going to get the offender that's the least likely to reoffend. I won't put them in drug court because we're going to have success there. And the science showed that the reality was that those individuals we were targeting for our drug courts actually tend to have worse outcomes because they're involved in drug courts. And those middle and high risk offenders that we were shying away from the science showed very clearly they're the ones where you get the greatest impact. That's where you bend the curve the most. So it was the data-driven and the science-based outcomes that we were experiencing, that we're finding other states experience, and that drove most of what we did in our reform package. We're early in the process. We haven't had an opportunity to see the recidivist numbers and some of the things that South Carolina, Texas, and some of the others have seen, but we have seen some good things already taking place. And one of the concerns that we heard from law enforcement, district attorneys, county commissioners, bringing different concerns as they were going through the process. And one of those concerns was, as we're changing the threshold level, felony threshold level, as we're taking weighted measures with drug possession, so that we're varying those sentences based on the weight instead of just possession. One of the things that we were hearing from county commissioners and sheriffs was, you're shifting the burden from the state to the county. You're going to be filling our jails. We're going to be covering the cost now. So we included in our package some things to address those issues as well. In Georgia, we have probation detention centers. They were intended to be 180 days sentences where we send those violators of probation. They had become used by judges getting 1- and 2-year sentences in probation detention centers. We have a number of residential substance abuse treatment programs within the state, and a few of our prisons with several hundred beds altogether. So we started hearing from the sheriffs their concerns. But prior to criminal justice reform, when someone is sentenced in Georgia, the clerk mails a sentencing package to the Department of Corrections. It may sit on the desk for a while. It may not be processed right away. The state is not liable for that offender until the Department of Corrections acknowledges the receipt. So it may be 30 to 45 days that those counties are having to house those state sentenced inmates without any reimbursement from the state for those 30 to 45 days. So we put electronic sentencing packages in place, and as soon as those electronic sentencing packets are sent in, the clock starts ticking. So where counties were housing state offenders for 30 to 45 days without any state funds to help them offset the cost, we now have only a handful of offenders in county jails waiting to be sent to prison. We're getting them almost without fail. We're getting them within those 15 days that we're supposed to get them in. So that's eased the burden a great deal on county jails. Also, probation detention centers, we capped at 180 days. So prior to reform, we had 669 individuals that were waiting on a probation detention center bed in the county jails, not receiving any state funds for those beds. That was all county expense. We have 0 today that are waiting on a probation detention center bed in our county jails. We had offenders waiting in county jails on residential substance abuse treatment beds. We opened up 3 new facilities for a total of 600 new residential substance abuse treatment beds. Those RSAT beds, we're getting those offenders into the RSAT beds. So we have basically alleviated in the county jails any state offenders in those county jails, which has had an incredible impact on the law. So we did some things to address the concerns that they had. We're seeing some success in those areas already, and I believe that we'll continue to see it. We've implemented strategies to make sure we're going to be tracking, we're going to be seeing those results, and I think those are all very important parts of what we did in Georgia.
Our effort started in March of 2012. Our situation was that our prison numbers were edging upward. Our crime rate was steady. Our recidivism rate was higher than it should be. These are all common factors that I hear from our fellow states. And South Dakota was in a situation where we needed to start planning for and spending money for building new prisons. A new women's prison in about 5 years, according to projections, and a new men's prison certainly within the next decade. And so the governor, being faced with putting that in his budget, called his staff together and said, I'd like to do something else. I'd like to find a better way to spend this money. I'd like to see if we can get a better result in our criminal justice system, in our correction system. I want you to put together a work group. I want you to study that issue, but I don't want you to compromise public safety. I remember that clearly at our very first work group meeting. The governor came to the meeting and told us what our charge was, to see if we could do better, to see if we could improve our criminal justice system while incarcerating fewer prisoners, but not at the expense of public safety. Our work group, which was a very comprehensive group of folks, it included all the players that we could lay our hands on, from judges to prosecutors to defense attorneys to law enforcement to social services to treatment facilities, down the line, everyone that we could touch to get input on how we're going to address this issue was on the work group. It was about a 20-person work group. And the process was kicked off by a news conference that was attended by the governor, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and legislative leaders from both parties of the legislature. And I think that's a key important part, to see those people in front of the cameras announcing this initiative, announcing this effort, and what we were going to study and what we were going to try to do. And that set the tone for the meetings that we were going to have. They were not easy meetings. This is not easy work. There are difficult issues and subjects to address. One of the big questions we had, as everybody does, I think, is what are the drivers? Who do we have in prison? Why are they there? How long are they there for? And how is that different from places that seem to have a declining prison population, and ours is going up? Well, in South Dakota, and this may be true elsewhere, we had a bit of a disconnect between our judicial branch of government, which prosecuted and sentenced and sent to prison our criminals, and our executive branch, the correction system, that received them at the prison and dealt with them. And there seemed to be a Grand Canyon chasm between those two entities, and we had a hard time putting the information. We had a hard time following our criminals from the courts through prison and parole. And so we contacted Pew to see if they would be willing to help us sort of bridge that gap and put together our numbers and tell us what we were doing perhaps differently than other states that had shown some success. And in February, we passed comprehensive reforms in our legislature, in our Senate, by a vote of 33-2, and in our House of Representatives by a vote of 63-7. So we maintained that wide support. We can talk more later about the process of putting together the package. One thing I think is important to note is that it needs to come forward as one package. The players at the table must, from the get-go, agree to compromise to get what's best for everyone. And if they're willing to do that, I mean, I think you could interview every one of our 20-some work group members, and not a single member would say that the end result was 100% perfect in their mind. But if you get the right people that are willing to say, I am so interested in getting this part of the reform package that I'm willing to give a little bit in this area. In regards to the participation of law enforcement, obviously they are a key component. And I think it's important, it just so happens that I happen to be the only person with law enforcement criminal justice experience in our legislature. So it fell on me to interact with my counterparts from the law enforcement community. And sure, stereotypically, law enforcement that's their job is to seek out and throw in jail the bad guys. But I can tell you that that informed law enforcement leaders, they see even more clearly than man on the street the results of our imperfect criminal justice system. They see the recycling of criminals. They see people that they apprehend and prosecute and put in prison back out on the street in 2 years, a better criminal and nothing else as a result of their incarceration. So I think if you deal with thoughtful law enforcement leaders, that they see the wisdom and in getting better bang for your buck, getting a better result. I don't want to downplay the importance of saving money, and I think Adam is right that it's too easily portrayed as this is a money-saving effort. There's so much more for the betterment of our society, but I can tell you that money is important. Money is always important to legislators, and it's more important to some than to others, and money can very often be a trigger. Again, in our state, we had this sort of looming build a prison pretty soon attitude, and that was sort of what pushed us into doing something. Are we going to start appropriating money to build these new prisons, or are we going to look at redirecting it and see if we can get a better result in a better way?
I think sometimes what gets lost in the discussion when we focus on public safety first, which I can guarantee you that all of us have engaged in this, it just doesn't fly unless you realize that truth first, that public safety has to come first. And in no way are any of these efforts soft on crime, as you heard from the video. In fact, I think we're smart on crime and tough on criminals. I think that was one of the better things I've heard said. Having said that, I think when tight state budgets have given us some open field running in that regard, and it's really about return on investment, and it's about exploding corrections costs versus flatlining funding to education, for instance. And so you see that dichotomy, and as legislators, we see the need to fund certain areas of government that aren't getting what they need, but yet corrections constitutionally continues to get the bulk of some of these dollars. We educate, medicate, and incarcerate in state budgets oftentimes. So we see these trends. These gentlemen have identified. We talked about exploding prison populations, corrections costs, poor recidivism numbers, little efforts at reentry, high levels of low-level drug offenders in prison, low-level possession offenders, high levels of technical parole violators in prison. We've identified these trends. The piece that I think impacted me the most when we first started our journey in Kentucky was that by and large, again, we're talking about a population, if you poll the public, most of this centers around nonviolent, non-serious, non-chronic offenders. Not that you can't move the needle in other areas and improve outcomes. We did several things in Kentucky to deal with more serious offenders, but as it relates to those issues, the public is not concerned, as you pointed out, with whether it's a 17-month sentence or a 23-month sentence. They're concerned about whether that individual will reoffend. I mean, that's when they come back to the community, and our secretary, as we have a couple people from our cabinet here on that, likes to say that the vast majority, and a high 90 percentile, of those serving prison now will come back to your local community in some way. So it's important that they are properly reintegrated into society and that you make efforts of reentry. And again, that goes to your point, it all falls back on that machinery. And we had to hire 90 new probation and parole, 65 new officers and the rest in staff, support staff, to handle this new focus on reentry and focus on reducing recidivism, which we've done. And that's where your real savings come in. So I think that was what, and just the public opinion again, is that the public truly does care about their return on investment.